Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, number 34 for mid-July 2024. Sweet Tooth, Wilbur, Baker, Hershey. Welcome to the 34th episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, an historic and active cemetery in Bala, Pennsylvania. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, volunteer tour guide, and volunteer podcaster. I am recording this in mid-July of 2024. Laurel Hill West opened in 1869 across the river from its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill East in Philadelphia. It's more than twice as big as Laurel Hill East. It has a totally different feel and a strikingly different population. Like Laurel Hill East, it is open 365 days a year, now from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Lots of parking at the business office just off Belmont Avenue, or keep driving, go to the conservatory and the bell tower. If you follow from Belmont, just follow the road past the second gate. Look for the road with the line, the white line in the middle. That'll take you directly to the bell tower. You can also just come in while you're walking or biking or skateboarding on the Kidwood Trail. A couple of years ago, Laurel Hill West started offering a confectioner's tour. And I learned about chocolate pioneer Oscar Wilbur and coconut king Franklin Baker. Now, I'd already covered ice cream and its makers in an earlier podcast, Biographical Bytes from Bala number 13, Every Brilliant Thing, Ice Cream. I talked about sugar magnate William Harrison in All Bones Considered number 50, A Couple of Haunted Houses. I also talked about sugar beet pioneer chemist Rachel Lloyd in All Bones Considered number 11, She Invented What? In this podcast, you're going to learn about the origins of chocolate in the Americas and Europe and discover the chocolatiers Oscar Wilbur and Milton Hershey, who used it to make their fortunes. You will also hear of Franklin Baker, who received a shipload of coconuts in exchange for a shipload of grain to the Caribbean. He used it to set up his company and earn his fortune. I had planned to talk about gum magnate Frank Fleer, but I'm going to include him in a later podcast that will also include the Loudon and Dietrich families. Let's start with Oscar Wilbur. Much of this script is taken from the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia and the chapter Candy and Candy Makers, composed by Jack McCarthy, copyright 2023 by Rutgers University. The modern concept of candy, sweet treats mass-produced as small pieces or bars, was unknown in early America. Prior to the mid-19th century, small treats were generally fruits or nuts flavored with spices or sweeteners. These were sold by local food merchants, or in some cases by confectioners, as those who specialized in sweet treats were known. Philadelphia was America's preeminent international trading center in this period, with a substantial sugar trade with the Caribbean that gave the city's food sellers access to a wide range of imported fruits and nuts, as well as sugar and spices with which to flavor them. Although some confections were made locally, most were imported. Either way, sweet treats were an expensive delicacy in the 18th century, delights that only the wealthy could afford. Beginning in the 1790s, thousands of French-speaking immigrants escaped revolutions in France and Haiti and settled in Philadelphia. Several of them established confectionery businesses. City newspapers included advertisements for many of these confectioners in the late 18th and early 19th century, a period in which Philadelphia was known for its confections. Writer Washington Irving, in his Stranger in Pennsylvania travelogue, published in 1807, noted that Philadelphia was, quote, famous for an excellent kind of confectionery made from the drainings of sugar, end quote. The Philadelphia Directory for 1816 listed more than 20 confectioners operating in the city. Several black confectioners were active in Philadelphia in this period. The 1838 Register of Trades of the Colored People of the City of Philadelphia and Districts listed names and addresses of 5 confectioners, and the 1856 Statistics of the Colored People of Philadelphia noted that 7 confectioners and pastry cooks were working in the city. By 1857, there were some 200 confectioners with businesses in Philadelphia, about half of whom made what would be considered candy. The other half specialized in other types of sweet treats, such as ice cream, jellies, and pastries. James Wood Parkinson, 1818-1895, one of the most influential cooks in 19th century America, did both. Parkinson operated fashionable restaurants and confectionery salons on Chestnut Street in the 1840s and 1850s. I talked about him in Biographical Bytes from Bala, number 13. That was a podcast I did about the ice cream business in Laurel Hill. While Parkinson was renowned for his ice cream, an 1840 business directory noted that his salon also offered, quote, a great variety of bonbons and fancy confectionery, and took orders, quote, from any part of the United States for preserved fruits in sugars or brandy, sugar almonds, and candy and confectionery in general. Parkinson edited the Confectioner's Journal from 1874 until 1895. The Industrial Revolution brought machine-based bulk production processes to candy making in the mid-19th century. While traditional confectioners continued to fashion treats by hand, others produced them in large quantities in steam-powered factories. Advances in sugar refining and a switch from cane to sugar beets as the source for raw materials made large-scale production of sugar-based products profitable for many candy makers. Chemist Rachel Lloyd, buried in the south section of Laurel Hill East, was one of the main scientists responsible for this switch. Sugar beets did not require the labor of enslaved people to make a profit, unlike sugar cane. Sweet treats, previously the province of the rich, became affordable to the masses, and by the 1860s, Philadelphians could purchase a wide range of sugary products from cheap penny candies to fine confections. Coincident with this development was the emergence of chocolate as a flavored sweet treat. Chocolate had been available in America since colonial times, but it was mostly used as a beverage and generally consumed unsweetened. In the latter part of the 19th century, confectioners developed methods of processing chocolate, adding sugar, later adding milk, that improved its texture and sweetened its taste, and made it appealing as candy. I will talk about that more in the segments on Milton and Kitty Hershey and on Henry Oscar Wilbur. Consumption of chocolate soared in the United States in the late 19th century, and Philadelphia was one of the leading producers. Stephen F. Whitman, 1823 to 1888, Laurel Hill East, Section 2, Lot 4, All Bones Considered Number 4, Holidays Among the Stones. Stephen F. Whitman was the most successful Philadelphia chocolate maker. He first appeared in the 1844 city directory as a fruiterer at 3rd and Market Streets, and in December 1845 advertised that he had just opened a new fruit and confectionery store at 12th and Market Streets, a large building that would serve as headquarters for his growing retail and manufacturing business for some 40 years. In addition to developing new production processes, Whitman instituted what were then innovative business practices, such as investing heavily in advertising and creating distinctive packaging for his products, including the novel approach of selling candies in attractive boxes. Whitman's choice mixed sugar plums, introduced in 1854, was the first packaged set of candies to be sold in a printed, trademarked box. Sugar plum, by the way, was a type of sugar-coated candy. It was not a fruit product. Henry Oscar Wilbur was Philadelphia's other major 19th century chocolate maker. Like Whitman, Wilbur was from a local Quaker family. He opened a confectionery business in partnership with Samuel Croft, 1834-1935, on North 3rd Street in 1865. Croft, Wilbur and Company prospered. They moved to larger headquarters on Market Street near 12th, just a few doors from Whitman Chocolates. In 1884, the company separated into two businesses, H.O. Wilbur and Sons and Croft and Allen. Both operated large factories. Croft and Allen were at 33rd and Market Street in West Philadelphia. Wilbur was at 3rd and New Streets in the neighborhood that we now call Old City. 1882, 204 confectioners operating in Philadelphia. They employed 1,952 workers, 823 men, 738 women, and 391 children. Women were an important part of the city's candy manufacturing workforce from the industrial era through the early 21st century. They often sorted candies on assembly lines, or they added decorative finishes in the candy-making process. And not only that, a woman could make $1.75 to $2 daily for her labor. That's about twice as much as other unskilled labor at that time. Whitman and Wilbur expanded significantly in the late 19th and early 20th century. Whitman moved to 6th and Cherry Streets in 1886 after its building at 12th and Market was destroyed by fire. And then, in 1906, to a very large factory at 4th and Race, just 2 blocks from Wilbur. Wilbur opened an additional plant in Lidditz, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1913, while it maintained operations in its Old City location. Now, this period also saw the establishment of several new longtime candy companies, as well as the introduction of many signature products. All of these are affiliated with Philadelphia and its surroundings. According to its company history, Richardson Mints began in 1883 with Thomas de Courtell Richardson, 1849-1935, Laurel Hill East, Section 7, Lots 18 and 20. Richardson sold his homemade mints at a Philadelphia department store counter. He later incorporated the company with his 2 sons in 1890. Goldenberg Candy Company, founded by Romanian Jewish immigrant David Goldenberg, 1869 to 1935, and his family. They founded it in 1890. And then they created the Peanut Chew in 1917 as a military ration for World War I soldiers. It was introduced to the general public after the war. It was manufactured at Goldenberg's large plant at I and Ontario Streets in Kensington. In 1949, the company moved to a factory on West Wyoming Street in Feltonville. Asher's Chocolates began when Canadian immigrant Chester A. Asher, 1868 to 1944, interred at Ivy Hill Cemetery. Asher opened a small candy store near Independence Hall in 1892. In 1896, he moved the business to Germantown, and it remained there for a century. Asher's is still in business. It's being run by the fifth generation. It specializes in sugar-free chocolate creation. Tradition has it that George Renninger, 1856 to 1944, who was a longtime employee of the Wonderly Candy Company in Northern Liberties, invented candy corn with company founder, German immigrant Philip Wunderlich, 1845 to 1929. They invented that in 1888 under its original name, Chicken Feed. Although it is mostly a seasonal treat, candy corn produces about 9 billion pieces of candy annually. Harvest corn adds chocolate. It's available around Thanksgiving. Other non-Halloween variants include Christmas, reindeer corn, Easter, bunny corn, Independence Day, freedom corn, and Valentine's Day, Cupid corn. And if you look real hard, you can find candy corn flavored Oreos, M&Ms, and marshmallows. Isaac Roskam, 1839-1904, found a Quaker City and Confectionery Company at Germantown and Susquehanna Avenues in North Philadelphia in 1893. It was that same year that he introduced Good and Plenty, a licorice candy in small hard-shell pieces that is considered the oldest branded candy in the United States. Roskam is interred at Mount Sinai. The fruity version of Good and Plenty is called Mike and Ike. That popped up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1940. It was manufactured by the Just Born Company, followed 10 years later by the cinnamon-flavored Hot Tamales, and then Peeps in 1953. Just Born now also produces Goldenberg's Peanut Chews. Well, as the Civil War was ending in 1865, entrepreneur Henry Oscar Wilbur took a chance on a business opportunity with partner Samuel Croft that came with the rise of the railroads, producing molasses and hard candies for sale on passenger trains. William Loudon did something similar to this with his cough drops. Loudon made his hard candies, they were called mashi, at home in Reading, in the family kitchen. But Reading is the home, or was the home, of one of the world's largest railroads. So Loudon would go to the train station, and he would go on the trains, and he would give boxes of his lozenges for cough and sore throat to the train conductors, who then handed them out to passengers who quickly became loyal customers. I will tell more about Loudon in another podcast. Wilbur and Croft expanded within Philadelphia several times in just under 30 years. They also added chocolate-making capabilities to their operations. As Henry Wilbur moved towards his 1887 retirement, he spun off the chocolate business in 1884, and he elevated his sons William Nelson Wilbur and Harry L. Wilbur into greater leadership and created a true family business with a very literal name, H.O. Wilbur and Sons. A third son, Dr. Bertram K. Wilbur, would also join the company in 1900 when Harry passed away. The three sons are buried in Wayne, Pennsylvania. As business grew at the end of the 19th century, the Wilbur brothers brought other relatives into the fold, most notably two of their uncles, Henry's brothers, who had received training and experience making chocolate in France and Germany. It was their ingenuity that helped create the Wilbur Bud in 1894, a mouth-sized glop of milk chocolate in the shape of a flower bud. In 1907, Hershey introduced the very similar Hershey's Kiss, which prompted Wilbur to sue in 1909. The suit was unsuccessful, and while the Wilbur Bud remained a long-time popular candy, the Hershey Kiss ultimately became more successful. The name Wilbur is stamped on the base of the chocolate piece, by the way. By 1905, the third generation of Wilburs entered the picture, including Lawrence H. Wilbur, another European-trained chocolatier, who would develop a machine which would wrap the Wilbur Buds in foil. When H.O. Wilbur and Company incorporated in January 1909, the prospering chocolate business began seeking expansion opportunities through partnerships with and acquisitions of other chocolate producers. The business also continued to expand its physical footprint in its native Philadelphia at this time. Chocolate making had already been a large-scale industry in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, for many years, when Wilbur merged with Swiss company Suchard Société Anonyme and assumed operations of Lidditz-based Brewster Ideal Cocoa and Chocolate Company in the late 1920s, early 1930s. When Henry Oscar Wilbur died in 1925, he was interred in a modest mausoleum in the Rockland section of Laurel Hill West. And one of the changes along the way, Wilbur's official company name became Wilbur Suchard Chocolate Company Incorporated, and a permanent consolidation of operations from Philadelphia and Newark, New Jersey, moved to Lidditz. It was completed by 1933. The Lidditz plant was located right next to the Reading Railroad freight station. This made national distribution very easy. But at the end of 1958, Suchard and Wilbur parted ways. Wilbur would refocus its efforts on making only Wilbur chocolate, and the company name changed again, this time to the Wilbur Chocolate Company. Despite multiple changes in corporate ownership, Wilbur Chocolate has thrived into the 21st century. It continues to produce a variety of chocolate bar products, chocolate as an ingredient to food producers, and, of course, the Wilbur Bud. The Wilbur Bud recipe has remained unchanged despite all of the other business changes through the years, including the final closing of the original Lidditz production plant on Broad Street in 2016. The Wilbur Buds you purchase today are born from the same uncomplicated recipe and molding process devised all those decades ago. So, what other candies came out of Philadelphia? 1905, five Blumenthal brothers, sons of German immigrants, founded Blumenthal Brothers Chocolate Company, and they produced popular candies, goobers, snowcaps, and raisinets. Their factory was at Margaret and James Street in the Frankfurt neighborhood, beginning in the 1910s. They also made, I have not thought of a chunky bar in 50 years. But I used to really like chunky bars, that trapezoidal chocolate bar with nuts and raisins. And the Blumenthals also had their own versions of Buds and Kisses. They called theirs milk chocolate treats. Few of the third-generation Blumenthals were interested in the business, so a new company called Ward Candy was formed after its sale in 1969. One of the third-generation Blumenthals is interred at Laurel Hill West. Saltwater taffy was invented at Atlantic City, New Jersey in the 1880s. Became a longtime favorite at New Jersey beach towns. It contains no seawater, but it is made with both salt and water. And as any true Philadelphian knows, the term taffy without the salt water refers to a lollipop. Frank H. Fleer, 1857-1921, established a chewing gum company in 1885 that introduced the candy-coated gum Chiclets in 1895, followed in 1928 by Double Bubble, the first successful bubble gum. In 1930, the company moved to a large building on North 10th Street in Olney, where it operated for 65 years. Another local candy maker, the Philadelphia Chewing Gum Corporation, founded in 1947, introduced Swell bubble gum, which it manufactured at its plant on Eagle Road in Havertown, Delaware County, for 55 years. Both of these companies, Fleer and Philadelphia Chewing Gum, branched into making and selling trading cards with their bubblegum products. If you ever drove through Havertown when that plant was up and running, you would be overwhelmed by the smell of bubble gum. It was very similar to an experience I had once when I was walking through South Boston, and I caught the unmistakable whiff of a giant roll of Necco wafers, and sure enough, on the next block there was the New England Candy Company. Some smells just stay with you for life. In the early 1930s, H.O. Wilbur phased out operations in Philadelphia and consolidated manufacturing at its Lidditz location. About the same time, Wilbur acquired its former partner, Croft and Allen, which had failed during the Depression. Even as these large candy makers closed or moved out of the city, new ones formed to take their place. In many cases, they were started in a family kitchen, like Luden's, or as a small storefront operation that grew over time into large or mid-size producers. I'll do another Sweet Tooth episode of All Bones Considered eventually, and I'll tell you more about William Luden and his cough drops, Frank Fleer and his bubble gum, and Richardson mints, and probably a couple of other things. That's in a future episode. This episode, what we still have coming, Franklin Baker and his coconut, and Milton and Kitty Hershey. If you want more information on Philadelphia candy makers, I recommend the entry Candy and Candy Makers in the online Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. Franklin Baker Sr., 1846 to 1923. Franklin Baker Jr., 1872 to 1946. Sublime in the coconut. I'm sure that you've heard the tired old phrase, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That is, of course, on the assumption that you have access to clean water, ice, sugar, a pitcher, and some glasses. You'd be far better off if life gave you coconuts. Picture this. You're a grain merchant in Philadelphia, the late 19th century. You've got plenty of competition, but you're doing okay for yourself. In 1894, you send a shipment of flour to Cuba, and in return, you get a boatload of coconuts, thousands of them. You've heard of coconuts. You may have even seen and tasted one at a local confectionery, but your knowledge about these brown, hairy, hard-shelled mysteries is next to nothing. As an expedient, you figure out how to convert your shipment of human head-sized, nuts, fruits, into dry shredded coconut, and it sells. Now you're curious. What else could you do with this cannonball-like growth that would kill you if it dropped onto your head from a second or third story window? Now, out of necessity, flour merchant Franklin Baker became one of the world's experts on the growth, harvesting, manufacturing, and distribution of coconut throughout the world. In fact, in the United States, his name is practically synonymous with coconut. If you thought that Baker's coconut was packaged just for bakers, you are wrong. The name came from the man who made his fortune on the wholesome treat and who's interred at Laurel Hill West, Franklin Baker. The coconut palm tree, also called Nux indica or Indian nut, is probably one of the most useful plants in the world. The coconut palm is one of more than 180 genera, which among them have around 2,600 species. Its origins can be traced to Austronesia. That's the myriad of islands that are found in a horseshoe around Australia, Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia, Indonesia, etc. Coconuts spread during the Neolithic period as far west as the Pacific Isles. Early seagoers found that an exclusive diet of coconut could sustain them for weeks or even months, so they had a large stash on board for their sea voyages. Coconuts were introduced by Europeans to the Americas during the colonial era in the Columbian Exchange, but there is evidence of a possible pre-Columbian introduction of Pacific coconuts to Panama by Austronesian sailors. We know for certain there were coconut palms in Puerto Rico in the late 16th century. Coconut palms do not like the cold. They may not survive in freezing weather. For coconut trees to grow without any care, there has to be mean temperatures above 12 or 13 degrees centigrade, that's 55 degrees Fahrenheit, every day of the year, a mean annual rainfall of more than a meter, and no or very little overhead canopy, since even the small trees require direct sunlight. The reason you see so many palm coconuts near the shore whenever you see a representation of a desert island is because sandy soil and salt spray limit what else can grow in that area. In fact, unique to most plants, you can safely irrigate coconut trees with seawater twice weekly. The trees can grow up to 30 meters tall, about 100 feet. Each can yield up to 75 fruits per year, although 25 or 30 is more typical. In 2022, almost 3/4 of the world's 62 million ton supply of coconuts was produced by Indonesia, India, and the Philippines. A coconut is not a nut, but technically it's not a fruit either. It's a drupe. It's a D-R-U-P-E, not D-R-O-O-P, with the fibrous mesocarp, or the husk. In botany, a drupe, or a stone fruit, has an outer fleshy part, the exocarp or skin, and then the mesocarp or the flesh. And that surrounds a single shell, the pip or the pit or the stone of hardened endocarp, and then there's a seed or a kernel inside the pit. Flowering plants that produce drupes include coffee, mango, olive, most palms, cannabis, pistachio, cashew, all members of the genus Prunus, including the almond, apricot, cherry, damson, peach, nectarine, and plum. The term freestone refers to a drupe that has a stone which can be removed easily from the flesh. Freestone plums are preferred for making homegrown prunes. Freestone sour cherries are preferred for making pies and cherry soup. Clingstone refers to a drupe that has a stone which cannot be easily removed from the flesh. The flesh is attached strongly to the stone and must be cut to free the stone. Clingstone varieties of fruits in the genus Prunus are preferred as table fruit and for jams, like cling peaches. It's because the flesh of clingstone fruits tends to be more tender and juicier. A coconut tree takes about 4 to 5 years to grow from seed to mature, and then another 3 to 4 years before it starts to produce fruits. After that, you should see new growth every year, especially during the wet season, the so-called monsoon season, depending on what part of the world that it's in. The fruiting starts with the coconut tree producing flowers and then continues until the fruits mature and ripen. That can take up to a year. Coconut trees have been known to be able to live for up to 300 years. Virtually every part of the coconut palm can be used by humans in some manner and has significant economic value. In fact, coconut's versatility is noted in its naming. In Sanskrit, it's called Kalpa Vriksha, the tree which provides all the necessities of life. In the Malay language, it is Pokok Seribu Guna, the tree of 1,000 uses. And in the Philippines, the coconut is commonly called the tree of life. Starting from the bottom, The roots are used as a dye, mouthwash, and a folk medicine for diarrhea and dysentery, notably in Cambodia. A frayed piece of root can also be used as a toothbrush. Coconut palm trunks don't gather rings as they age. The wood can be used to build small bridges and huts. It's chosen for its straightness, its strength, and its salt resistance. And in parts of India, coconut trunks are used for house construction. Coconut timber from the trunk is increasingly being used as an ecologically sound substitute for endangered hardwoods. Hawaiians hollow out the trunk to form drums, containers, or even small canoes. The branches are strong and flexible enough to make a switch. The stiff midribs of coconut leaves are used for making brooms in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Maldives, and the Philippines. The green of the leaves is stripped away, leaving the veins, long, thin, wood-like strips, which are tied together to form a broom or a brush. And a long handle made from some other wood may be inserted into the base of the bundle and used as a two-handed broom. The evergreen leaves are called fronds. The palm branch was a symbol of triumph and victory in classical antiquity. The Romans rewarded champions of the games and celebrated military successes with palm branches. Early Christians used the palm branch to symbolize the victory of the faithful over enemies of the soul. The Palm Sunday festival, the week before Easter, celebrates the entry of Jesus Christ into Jerusalem. The Catholic Church then uses ashes from burnt palm to anoint foreheads at the beginning of Lent. Palms are mentioned more than 30 times in the Bible, at least 22 times in the Quran. In Judaism, the palm represents peace and plenty. It's one of the 4 species of sukkot, along with the willow branch, the myrtle, and the citron. The palm may also symbolize the tree of life in Kabbalah. The leaves also provide material for baskets that can draw water from a well or thatch a roof. They can be woven into mats, cooking skewers, kindling arrows as well. Leaves are woven into small pouches that are filled with rice and cooked to make puso and ketupat. Dried coconut leaves can be burned to ash, which is harvested for lime. In India, woven coconut leaves are used to build wedding marquees. The leaves are also used for thatching houses and decorating climbing frames. Coconut fiber, also called coir, C-O-I-R, is the hairy stuff that you can extract from the outer husk. It's used in products like floor mats, doormats, brushes, mattresses. Some coconut geotextiles are now being used to provide a cover for dirt roads in India. The culinary uses of coconut are staggering. The edible white fleshy part of the seed, the endosperm, is known as coconut meat or flesh or the kernel. When it's dried, it's called copra. Coconut meat is a high-calorie source of energy. A whole coconut, solid and liquid, can supply up to 1,400 calories. 100 grams or 3.5 ounces of raw coconut meat supplies about 350 calories from 33 grams of fat, 15 grams of carbohydrate, and 3 grams of protein. Harvesting coconuts is a labor-intensive process. There are several movies on YouTube that show the work in Thailand, where there are huge plantations, hundreds of acres on which palms grow next to man-made canals. Workers use long-handled saws and clippers to free a bundle of coconuts and then guide them so they fall into the water. This avoids potential damage from hitting the ground, avoids cracking the coconuts. They're then floated down to a gathering and processing area, loaded into trucks for transport to a factory. The young men doing hard labor in the tropical environment are barefooted. Many are working in waist-deep water to load the fruits into the trucks. The films are really interesting. Some coconut gatherers resort to the ancient method of simply climbing the tree. and then picking and throwing down the sought-after fruit. Crude but effective. Animal rights activists have spent years trying to rescue trained monkeys in Thailand. They have been forced into servitude to pick up to 1,000 coconuts per day. Humans can usually gather about 100 a day. At least 8 plantations have been investigated by People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals because of monkeys which have been captured as infants or youth and trained in chains for the profit of human beings. If you are like most people, you don't want the trouble of cracking a coconut on your own, since what you probably want is freshly shredded coconut meat, also known as grated coconut or flakes. It is dehydrated by drying or baking until it has less than 3% of the original moisture content of coconut meat. Desiccated coconut is used in the baking and confection industry, as it has a far longer shelf life than freshly grated coconut. That is what is used in treats like macaroons or popular candy bars like Almond Joy or Mounds bars. Almond Joy, I'm sure you remember, is essentially the same as a Mounds bar, except that it has nuts on top, and Mounds has a darker chocolate, and they have different colored wrappers, but they're essentially the same. Remember the old ad campaign, sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't, back in the 1970s? The earliest edible meat is available at about 6 to 7 months after flowering. Filipinos call it malauhag, literally mucus-like. It has a translucent appearance and a gooey texture. Malakanan, literally cooked rice-like, refers to coconut meat around 7 or 8 months old. It is more opaque. It is whiter. It has a soft texture like cooked rice and can still be easily scraped off the coconut shell. Then there is malakatid, which is literally leather-like. This refers to fully mature coconut meat at around 8 to 9 months old, with an opaque white appearance, a tough rubbery to leathery texture, and it's difficult to separate from the shell. There is no proven method to assess an unopened coconut. Younger coconuts tend to be smaller and have brighter colors. The more mature ones are larger and browner. Check it for cracks. They can be cracked when they're dropped from the trees, or they can be cracked in transit. Tap on the coconut to check for maturity. Malakatad and malakanan will have a hollow sound. Malauhag will sound solid. Shake the coconut. You should hear liquid sloshing around inside. If there is no liquid, the coconut is old and probably tasteless. Sniff around the eyes of the coconut. The least hint of mold suggests that the contents are inedible. Makapuno is a special cultivar of coconut that produces a large amount of jelly-like coconut meat that fills the entire interior of the coconut shell. It is used widely as a dessert in the Philippines. Coconut milk is obtained by pressing the grated coconut meat, usually with hot water added. The milk obtained contains anywhere from 5 to 20% fat. If you let that settle, coconut cream rises to the top, and that contains anywhere from 20% to 50% fat, most of it saturated. Coconut milk plus sugar gives us coconut syrup. Coconut skim milk only has 0.5% fat. Coconut milk powder, which is protein-rich, can be processed from coconut milk by centrifugation, separation, and spray drying. Coconut milk and coconut cream are often added to desserts, curries, and stews. And with sugar and or eggs added, coconut jam and coconut custard are both popular street foods in Southeast Asia. And you can extract oil from the milk, which can be used for frying or cooking or making margarine. Coconut water is what you hear sloshing around inside the younger fruits. It has been used for hundreds of years as the main source of potable water for certain isolated ocean island tribes. Now it's available as a sports drink. Per 12-ounce serving, coconut water contains about 75 calories, but really no essential nutrients. Street vendors in Southeast Asian markets will poke a hole in the soft eye of a coconut and insert a straw so you can sip on the treat as you stroll among merchants. Usually costs less than $1 to get a coconut. Of course, they see you coming as a tourist, it's probably going to cost a couple of bucks. But that's okay, it's pretty tasty. Coconut water can be fermented to produce coconut vinegar. Coconut flour has been developed for use in baking. Coconut sap is gathered by residents of the Philippine rural south area and distilled into a potent coconut wine called tuba, which is pretty hard work for little pay. A liter of tuba of Filipino coconut wine costs about $1.25. The husk and the shells can be used for fuel and are a source of charcoal. For many, drinking cups are made of coconuts, and they were thought to neutralize poison drinks. The husks can be used as flotation devices or as an abrasive to buff floors. Coconut shells are used as bowls. Coconut buttons are carved for Hawaiian shirts. The shell and the husk can be burned for smoke, which reportedly repels mosquitoes. The shell, freed from the husk and heated on warm ashes, exudes an oily material that is used to soothe toothaches in traditional medicine of Cambodia, probably because of the high lauric acid content. Lauric acid is anti-inflammatory, antifungal, and antibacterial. It was during World War II in the Pacific that Coast Watcher scout Biuku Gaza was the first of two from the Solomon Islands to reach the shipwrecked and wounded crew of motor torpedo boat PT-109, commanded by future U.S. President John F. Kennedy. There was no paper available, so Kennedy inscribed a message on a husked coconut shell. Nauru Isle Commander, that ISL Commander, native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive, needs small boat. Kennedy. President Kennedy kept that coconut on his desk in the Oval Office. It is now in the JFK Library in Boston. Coconut shells are also used as parts of various musical instruments in Southeast Asia. Some are carved into replica shrunken heads and sold to tourists. And of course, anyone who's seen the classic comedy movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail can tell you of another popular use for half coconut shells, recreating the sound of a horse clopping along a road, which led to an interesting discussion about swallows with a castle attendant. As I said at the beginning, Franklin Baker was a modestly successful Philadelphia flour miller who started the business of selling desiccated coconut in 1894 after he received a cargo of fresh coconuts from Cuba in payment for a consignment of flour he exported. Baker unsuccessfully had searched for a buyer for the coconuts, but he convinced himself that there was an untapped market. He came across a small business on Arch Street, which was about to fold. Baker bought it for a few $1,000s, and with his boatload of coconuts, he went into the coconut business. By 1897, 3 years, Franklin Baker, now 51 years old, had made so much progress with his new product, he decided to sell the flour business and concentrate on coconuts. It was about this time that Franklin Baker Jr. joined his father in the business that eventually became known as the Franklin Baker Company. It did not take long for Baker's Coconut to become the foremost supplier of coconut products in the United States. The Bakers quickly ran out of room on Arch Street, and in 1913 manufacturing facilities were moved to Brooklyn, New York, and in 1921 Franklin Baker Jr. put up plant facilities in Santa Mesa, Manila. This gave birth to the Franklin Baker Company of the Philippines. The original intention was to process coconuts in the Philippines to supply their New Jersey plant with desiccated coconut instead of importing whole coconuts from the Caribbean countries. In 1924, the business was relocated to Hoboken, New Jersey. General Foods Corporation acquired Franklin Baker Company in 1927, and operations were transferred to a bigger and modern factory in San Pablo City in Laguna, near abundant coconut supplies in the Philippines. During the Second World War, that San Pablo plant sustained heavy bombing damage, and operations were moved back to the United States to ensure continuity of the business. Fresh coconuts from Puerto Rico and Jamaica were brought to the Hoboken plant for processing. Eventually, the San Pablo plant was rebuilt in 1947 at its current location in the Philippines. In 1964, the U.S. processing facility was moved from Hoboken to Dover, Delaware. By this time, all the base processing was being done in the Philippines, while the Dover plant sweetened, toasted, and creamed the desiccated coconut for industrial and retail customers. In 1968, General Foods put up another plant for Franklin Baker in Davao to ensure a steady coconut supply for its manufacture. 1987, Philip Morris, owners of General Food, bought Kraft, and the Franklin Baker desiccated coconut products were put into the Kraft Food Ingredients Group. The Franklin Baker desiccated coconut products were branded as Baker's Coconut. Today, their products are shipped to more than 50 countries worldwide across North and South America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. Baker's Coconut is the leading and preferred supplier of desiccated coconut to major food manufacturers in the United States. It accounts for close to a 50% share of the total Philippine coconut exports to the USA. Philadelphia confectioners took advantage of the wealth of coconut available to experiment with different confections. And one day, nobody knows exactly who it was, somebody came up with a very popular Irish potato, which if you're not from Philadelphia, it's neither Irish nor is it a potato. The origin of this candy, coconut cream balls rolled in cinnamon, is unknown. Boy, I want one now that I'm thinking about it. It does remain a long-time Philadelphia area favorite. When I started working at Temple University Hospital in 2003, there was still a candy maker across the street on Germantown Avenue. And he stayed open for the first couple of years I worked at Temple. But I remember we would go get those Irish potatoes around St. Patrick's Day. Franklin Baker Sr. died after a long illness in Atlantic City in June 1923. There was virtually no mention of him in the newspapers. He is interred under a large stone in the Norriton section of Laurel Hill West. Franklin Baker Jr. died suddenly in May 1946 when he plummeted from his 9th floor apartment on fashionable East End Avenue in New York City. It was thought perhaps he had slipped when he threw open a window for some fresh air. Franklin Jr. is interred in the Hanover section, not far from the funeral home at Laurel Hill West. The history of chocolate and its creation from the beans of the cacao tree can be traced to the ancient Maya and even earlier to the ancient Olmecs of southern Mexico. The word chocolate may conjure up images of sweet candy bars and luscious truffles, but the confections of today bear little resemblance to the chocolate of the past. Throughout much of its history, chocolate was a bitter beverage, not a sweet, rich-tasting treat. But after it became popular in the courts of Europe and the streets of colonial America, chocolate soon evolved into the universally loved commodity it is today. Chocolate is made from the fruit of cacao trees, which are native to Central and South America. The fruits are called pods, and each pod contains around 40 cacao beans. The beans are dried and roasted to create cocoa beans. It's unclear exactly when cacao came on the scene or who invented it. Ancient Olmec pots and vessels from around 1500 BCE have been discovered with traces of theobromine, the stimulant compound found in chocolate and tea. It's thought the Olmecs used cacao to create a ceremonial drink. However, since they kept no written history, opinions differ on if they used cacao beans in their concoctions or just the pulp of the cacao pod. The Olmecs were the earliest known Mesoamerican civilization, which flourished from 1200 BCE to about 400 BCE. That's around the modern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. The name Olmec means rubber people, as the group had already discovered the secret of extracting latex from a locally grown rubber tree. The Olmecs undoubtedly passed their cacao knowledge on to the Central American Maya, who not only consumed chocolate, they revered it. Mayan writing history mentions the chocolate drinks being used in celebrations and to finalize important transactions and ceremonies. Despite chocolate's importance in Mayan culture, it wasn't reserved for the wealthy and powerful, but was readily available to almost everyone. In many Mayan households, chocolate was enjoyed with every meal. Mayan chocolate was thick and frothy and often combined with chili peppers, honey, or water. The Aztecs took chocolate admiration to another level. They believed cacao was given to them by their gods. Like the Maya, they enjoyed the caffeinated kick of hot or cold spiced chocolate beverages in ornate containers. But they also used cacao beans as currency to buy food and other goods. In Aztec culture, cacao beans were considered more valuable than gold. Aztec chocolate, which they called xocolotl, was mostly an upper-class extravagance, although the lower classes enjoyed it occasionally at weddings or other celebrations. Perhaps the most notorious Aztec chocolate lover of all was the Aztec ruler Montezuma II, who allegedly drank gallons of xocolotl each day for energy and as an aphrodisiac. It's also said that he reserved some of his cacao beans for his military. There are conflicting reports about when chocolate arrived in Europe, although it's agreed that it first arrived in Spain. One story says Christopher Columbus discovered cacao beans after intercepting a trade ship on a journey to America, and he brought the beans back to Spain with him in 1502. Another tale states Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés was introduced to chocolate by the Aztecs of Montezuma's court. After returning to Spain, cacao beans in tow, he supposedly kept his chocolate knowledge a well-guarded secret. A third story claims that friars who presented Guatemalan Mayans to Philip II of Spain in 1544 also brought cacao beans along as a gift. No matter how chocolate got to Spain, by the late 1500s it was a much-loved indulgence by the Spanish court, and Spain began to import chocolate in 1585. As other European countries such as Italy and France visited parts of Central America, they also learned about cacao and brought chocolate back to their respective countries. Soon, chocolate mania spread throughout Europe. With the high demand for chocolate came chocolate plantations, which were worked by thousands of enslaved people. But European palates weren't satisfied with the traditional Aztec chocolate drink recipe. They made their own varieties of hot chocolate with cane sugar, cinnamon, and other common spices and flavorings. Soon, fashionable chocolate houses for the wealthy cropped up throughout London, Amsterdam, and other European cities. Chocolate arrived in Florida on a Spanish ship in 1641. It's thought the first American chocolate house opened in Boston in 1682. By 1773, cocoa beans were a major American colony import, and chocolate was enjoyed by people of all classes. During the Revolutionary War, chocolate was provided to the military as rations and sometimes given to soldiers as payment instead of money. Now, when chocolate first came on the scene in Europe, it was a luxury only the rich could enjoy. But it was in 1828 that Dutch chemist Conrad van Houten discovered a way to treat cacao beans with alkaline salts to make a powdered chocolate that was easier to mix with water. This process became known as Dutch processing, and the chocolate produced, called cacao powder or Dutch cocoa. Van Houten supposedly also invented the cocoa press, although some reports say that his father invented that machine. The cocoa press separated cocoa butter from roasted cocoa beans to inexpensively and easily make cocoa powder, which was then used to create a wide variety of chocolate products. Both Dutch processing and the chocolate press helped make chocolate affordable for everyone. It also opened the door for chocolate to be mass-produced. 1847, British chocolatier J.S. Fry and Sons created the first chocolate bar, molded from a paste made of sugar, chocolate liquor, and cocoa butter. Swiss chocolatier Daniel Peter is generally credited for adding dried milk powder to chocolate to create milk chocolate in 1876. But it wasn't until several years later that he worked with his friend Henri Nestle, and together they created the Nestle Company and brought milk chocolate to the mass market. Chocolate had come a long way during the 19th century, but it was still hard and difficult to chew. 1879, another Swiss chocolatier, Rudolf Lindt, invented the chocolate conch machine. It mixes and aerates chocolate, giving it a smooth, melt-in-your-mouth consistency that blends well with other ingredients. And by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, family chocolate companies, Cadbury, Mars, Whitman, Wilbur, Hershey, were mass-producing a variety of chocolate confections to meet the growing demand for the sweet treat. Milton Snavely Hershey, the only surviving child of Henry Hershey and Fanny Snavely Hershey, was born 13 September 1857 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He received a formal education to only the 4th grade, but his father was a voracious reader and encouraged Milton to learn from literature. Milton dreamed of being a confectioner, and after 2 failed business attempts, he began an apprenticeship with Lancaster candy maker Joseph Ryder. He then opened the Lancaster Caramel Company in Philadelphia in the 900 block of Spring Garden in June 1876, the year of the centenary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Spring Garden Street was apparently just a little too far from the major activities, and this business failed. Over the next few years, Milton's candy business in Denver failed, and then he tried his luck in Chicago, New Orleans, New York. But no matter how hard he worked, he failed to make a profit. He moved back to Pennsylvania in 1886. He was 29 years old, so he's still young. Now, he had had some success selling caramel, penny candies, fruits and nuts. He really wanted to find a way to mass-produce chocolate for the everyday consumer, not just the rich. He had traveled to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition, deeply impressed with the European chocolatiers that he saw there. In fact, he bought a set of equipment, and in 1894 he created the Hershey Chocolate Company. It was a subsidiary to Lancaster Caramel Company, and he began testing his chocolate formulations. Within a year, Hershey's dreams were a success. He was producing different varieties of sweet and semi-sweet chocolates. In 1900, he successfully created his enormously successful milk chocolate, and he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million. He established the Hershey Chocolate Company as its own entity the same year to market his new formulation. By 1902, Milton Hershey built his first factory in the middle of cornfields in Dairy Church Township. It's about 95 miles northwest of Philadelphia. There was plenty of land, lots of fresh water, cows nearly as far as the eye could see to provide fresh milk. The town, Dairy Church, was named for him the next year, and Hershey, Pennsylvania, remains the world headquarters for the company. Milton built an ideal company town with schools, churches, and stores. The workers' houses were comfortable. Each had a garden. There was a post office and a trolley car, a library. The thriving town had two main streets which intersected Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue. His business had simplified. Instead of making 114 different kinds of fancy candy, as he had been doing, Milton Hershey made a simple milk chocolate candy bar. And there was economy of volume. Hershey sold millions of his iconic candy bars to rich and poor alike. Hershey's business skyrocketed in 1907 with the development of the Hershey Kiss, which was a blatant copy of the Wilbur Bud. I already told you about Wilbur and his lawsuit against Hershey. We know who won that battle. Hershey's now makes about 80 million kisses daily. The small candies were wrapped by hand from 1907 until Hershey got an automatic wrapping machine in 1921. Milton Hershey was a 40-year-old bachelor when he met and fell in love with Catherine Kitty Sweeney. After he courted her for a year, she was a ribbon salesperson at B. Altman's. They were married on 25 May 1898 in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. They could not be married in the church proper because Milton Hershey was a Mennonite. Kitty was a Catholic. She'd been born in Jamestown, New York, to Irish immigrant parents. And she met Milton Hershey when he was traveling for business. As I say, he was raised a Mennonite. Kitty was Irish Catholic. They fell in love. They decided to marry, much to the surprise of everyone back in Lancaster. Now, it was very common for husbands of this period. Milton looked at Kitty as a dependent child who needed attention and care. She was his excuse to take a break from his all-encompassing work. If Milton stayed away too long on a business trip, Kitty would phone his associates and instruct them, buy him a ticket and send him home. Kitty was known for her warm personality, quick wit, and beautiful smile, which brought joy to Milton's life. She also had a talent for landscape and interior design and contributed significantly to their home and the Milton Hershey School. Now, that school, despite their love for children, Milton and Kitty were unable to have their own children. So they founded the Hershey Industrial School for Orphan Boys that was managed by the Hershey Trust, later became known as the Milton Hershey School. Milton provided for Kitty's every need and wish. Not only did he buy her furs, Tiffany jewelry, but he bought her flowers every day. Again, he was raised as a Mennonite. Milton thought flowers were frivolous. To Kitty, they were a sign of beauty and happiness. She supervised the landscaping around High Point that included extensive gardens that were open to the public. After her death, Milton directed the construction of Hershey Gardens, remarking to horticulturalist Harry Erdman, "The more beautiful you can make the place look, the better life the people will have." December 1911. Milton made a $300 deposit with the White Star Line to book passage on the RMS Titanic for its maiden voyage from Europe to the United States. But Milton was summoned home a few days early. He sailed instead on the German liner SS America with a K, while Kitty stayed in Europe. While she was on her year-and-a-half-long trip to Europe, 1911 to 1913, Kitty could still walk, but she had trouble keeping her balance, and she always had to hold on to a companion's arm. And once she was back in Hershey, her condition continued to decline. It became more and more difficult for her to control her body movements. And by the end of 1914, she was nearly completely incapacitated. When her doctors could do nothing more for her, she turned to Christian Science as a means of comfort and support. Kitty and Milton were at Atlantic City in March 1915 when he was called away on business. Kitty made arrangements to return to Hershey with a new nurse to drive her in a convertible. This is in March. The numbness in her arms and legs made Kitty oblivious to heat and cold, and she insisted on riding with the top down. The day was cold and raw. Kitty's condition deteriorated with every mile. As they were passing through Philadelphia, Kitty was obviously too ill to continue the trip. They stopped at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Center City, and they contacted Milton. Kitty had pneumonia. Milton Hershey arrived in Philadelphia that same afternoon, Thursday, 25 March, 1915. After she greeted him, Kitty requested a glass of champagne, which her husband went personally to procure for her. By the time he returned, she had died. Milton had not realized the precariousness of his wife's health. And true to form, Kitty had known how ill she was, but she had not told anyone, not even Milton, about it. Kitty and Milton Hershey had shared 18 years together before her death. On the day of the funeral, 27 March 1915, Milton Hershey gave his employees the day off and provided a free train ticket to Philadelphia so they could attend the service. At Kitty's funeral, Milton confided to her sister Agnes Smith, "I never expected to marry." Their marriage, although tragically brief, had a tremendous and everlasting influence on Milton. In 1909, unable to have children on their own, Milton and Kitty established the Hershey Industrial School, now the Milton Hershey School. Milton would always say that the school was Kitty's idea. And 3 years after her death, Milton gifted the school's trust fund with the bulk of his fortune, ensuring that her idea would continue on in perpetuity. Milton realized something was missing in the town that he had created, a cemetery. He placed Kitty in a receiving vault at Laurel Hill West Cemetery, and she stayed there for nearly 4 years until his cemetery was finished. It took 4 years because of the Great War. But through that 4 years, Kitty had fresh flowers at the door of her crypt at least 3 times weekly. In 1918, Milton Hershey transferred ownership of the Hershey Chocolate Company, then valued at $60 million. That's the equivalent of $1.1 billion in today's dollars, to the Hershey Trust. Milton Hershey never remarried. He spent the next 30 years expanding his company and the Milton Hershey School. He was very careful after he became a widower. He said, "I am very nice to little children and real old ladies, but nothing in between." Until he died, Milton carried Kitty's picture with him everywhere he went. Hershey's products continued to evolve, and during World War II, the company came up with a non-melting chocolate bar packed with nutrient supplements for American troops in tropical climates. Yeah, we used to get those in Vietnam also. I think they were being made by a separate company by then, though. They weren't Hershey in the mid-'60s. but it could serve as a quick, simple meal. It was loaded with calories, maybe 300 or 400 calories in one little non-melting chocolate bar. Hershey sold more than 3 billion of these to the government. And there's Hershey syrup, which was often used in black and white movies to simulate blood. It was safe for performers to swallow, it was easy to wash out of clothing, and it was cheap to buy. Plus, it looked really good on film, that nice thick viscosity of blood and Hershey syrup. This effect was used in many movies, including The Wasp Woman and Psycho. Milton Hershey lived quietly in Hershey until his death 1 month after his 88th birthday on 13 October 1945. He was a philanthropist until the end and bequeathed most of his wealth to the Hershey Trust Company and the Derry Township Public Schools. He was buried next to his beloved Kitty in the cemetery that he built for her in the town that he built for both of them and for the thousands of children that they loved despite having none of their own. The August 2024 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, number 65, gets me back into familiar territory, medical fathers and mothers. This is actually going to be part 4 of that series, and I've got at least 1 and probably 2 more parts of this series coming. We have a lot of famous doctors buried at Laurel Hill. John Ray Barton, pioneering orthopod, namesake for the first academic surgical chair in the United States, also namesake for the Barton fracture. Richard Burr was a camp follower and itinerant surgeon during the Civil War. He's best remembered today for his grave robbing activities on the battlefield and one classic photo. Thomas Story Kirkbride was an innovative and creative alienist who established the Kirkbride Plan to build asylums. And Anna Lukens was a physician, pharmacist, and feminist leader who shattered a few glass ceilings along the way. In Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, episode number 35 from mid-August, it's a Civil War story. This is a bit odd for a cemetery that was founded 4 years after the war ended. It's about Lieutenant Colonel John Grable, the first graduate of the U.S. Military Academy to be killed in combat in 1861. Believe it or not, he is buried at Laurel Hill West. For more on activities and tours, we've got movies, we've got seminars, we've got lots of stuff going up. Go to the website, laurelhillphl.com/events. I am giving a tour at West on July 28th. I hope the temperatures go down. It's going to be Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. There are lots of trees. We're not going to walk that much. I want to cover the Summit section. Summit is the area just behind the conservatory and the bell tower. But there are so many important people buried there. I think we're going to have fun. All Bones Considered and Biographical Bytes from Bala are mostly research, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, a volunteer tour guide and volunteer podcaster for both cemeteries. You can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. The theme song, Names at Peace, is by local artist James Harrow. Maybe I will see you on a tour. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.